60,000 copies an hour. That's how many newspapers these presses can turn out, and they run. Too often recently they've been silent. For Fleet Street, long a world-famous symbol of the newspaper industry, is in trouble. Less than half the papers printed here make a profit. Often the management is inefficient. The unions insist on feather bedding.
Every unit has its crew, you see, has its complement of men. And however many units they decide to put on, so the complement of men is increased accordingly.
The worst problem centers on printing equipment. It's old and outmoded, yet the workers fight the introduction of new technology. The Observer, the oldest Sunday newspaper in the country. They've noticed that after 189 years, they have to close in October. The Observer actually increased circulation last year and now sells over 1 million copies a week. But because of old-fashioned printing methods, they lose money. 35 machine managers in the printing room are stopping them from modernizing. They want more money to change the way they work. The other unions on Fleet Street are angry at this attitude. Even been talk of inter-union warfare. 2,000 jobs at the Observer are at risk.
Big give and take, and it has to be a compromise, quite honestly. I mean, we all get situations where we are faced with a demand, a blackmail, one might say, or else, and quite frequently I myself in those circumstances say, no, I'm not going to pay.
The journalists in Fleet Street have a legend, the legend of the sugar daddy, a millionaire who wants to own a prestigious newspaper. He buys the paper and saves it, like Thompson did with the Times. It remains to be seen if the Observer will close and be sold, but clear that with these problems, the line of millionaires waiting to take a chance is getting shorter. Morrison, CTV News, London. Prime Minister Trudeau arrives in Venice. He'll be greeted by more than scenic views of the conference center on San Giorgio Island. He'll be surrounded by troops and police, legions of them. 8,000 Secret Service men alone are here for the two-day summit. Massive security is not just a formal precaution in a country plagued by terrorism, but also a reaction to a specific incident. Last month, the Red Brigades group gave notice it intends to carry out terrorist attacks during the meeting. The threat was delivered in a brutal and striking fashion. They killed the head of the Venice anti-terrorist squad, the same man who is largely responsible for security at this summit. This will be occupied by police. There are police with machine guns, police with walkie-talkies, police in boats making round-the-clock patrols. There are even diving boats to supply the frogmen who search the harbor floor for explosives. All this in a city where normal security problems are compounded by thousands of tourists and hundreds of canals. Precautions may seem excessive, but the leaders here will remember the Italian Prime Minister they sat beside at two previous summits, Aldo Moro, kidnapped in 1978 by the Red Brigades and murdered. Aaron Morrison, CTV News, Venice.
It was shortly after dawn when the 10 Americans were driven from the embassy compound. Still too early for the large and boisterous crowds. Instead, the reception was limited to a few dozen Iranians and the occasional shout of "Yankee, go home." The Americans were given a police escort through the center of the city on their way to the airport and to freedom. The blacks and 4 women were released on the orders of the Ayatollah Khomeini when it could not be proven they were spies. It was the end of what one of them described as a light, funny, tragic ordeal. Escorted to the airport by the Ayatollah's son, Ahmed Khomeini, they were still in the custody of their captors, a fact that well have influenced their remarks to reporters.
Like I said, it's difficult to assess the situation. There's still people there. We're still worried about them, and I don't think I ought to say anything that might cause them harm or anything like that.
There are now 49 American hostages left here, and no one can predict when they too might be released. John McKenzie, CTV News in Tehran.
Non-American reporter allowed inside the embassy.
We were allowed inside the embassy compound because the students said they had given up on the American networks. They claimed the occupation was not being properly portrayed, that their message was not getting through, and it was time to try dealing with someone else. The The meeting was set for 9:30, and after going through one of their security checks, we were led directly to the interview room, about 100 yards from the gate. During the morning, we talked to more than a dozen students. They were polite but firm. Mon and Rahim are two of the unspecified number of official student representatives, but they, like everyone else here, take their orders from the Ayatollah Khomeini. With the help of one of their interpreters, they explain that all of the 49 American hostages would go on trial, charged with varying degrees of espionage. When the trials begin is up to the Ayatollah. In the meantime, they said, the hostages are safe and being well treated. But will they be permitted to see members of their families?
There's a possibility.
In the near future? Soon?
That's not.
You're in the United States government. If they intervene militarily, you kill the hostages. Have you told the hostages this?
We have not said this to them, but we repeat that if they have any military intervention under the pretext of our judging and trialing the hostages, gives us the right to react.
Do you think if the Shah is not returned to Iran, it could end violently? Force might be used one side or the other?
According to us, it does not matter what happens later. This is our right, and we try to restore our natural rights. This is our right to obtain the king and put him on trial.
The siege is now 20 days old, but the students say they are not frustrated by the waiting. They say this is a struggle, and it's one that they enjoy. In contrast to the sights and sounds outside the embassy compound, the atmosphere inside is generally one of calm and order. This is a picture of U.S. diplomat Thomas Ahern, one of 50 hostages still inside the U.S. embassy. The other pictures of Ahern, one inside his diplomatic passport, and the other inside a Belgian passport under the name Paul Timmermans. It was found at the U.S. Embassy along with a 9-page document stamped secret on how to develop the Timmermans cover. Everything had been taken care of, everything from phony health records to bogus immigration stamps from Greece, Portugal, and Iran. They also provided the means to forge new ones. His cover was complete. According to personal data in your passport, you are single. Were born in Antwerp, Belgium, on the 8th of July, 1934. Your occupation is that of a commercial business representative. Documents were first revealed during an interview on the CTV program Canada AM. Students controlling the U.S. Embassy say they will use them as evidence. Evidence much against the United States as against any individual hostage.
The United States government considers revolutionaries who are struggling for the liberation of man from the chains of imperialist powers as terrorists. But it itself, with the CIA, is the most terrorizing power of all time. The United States has forged passport and important national seals of many countries of the world and has violated their rights of sovereignty. By forging European and Asian seals, sent spies to our home.
Students say Ahern has admitted possessing phony identity papers, but neither Ahern nor any of the other hostages has been told they could soon be on trial here as U.S. spies. Students refer to the U.S. Embassy as the House of Spies. Everyone who worked in it, they say, is guilty to some degree. So they have established that certain employees had more than one identity, but have yet to prove that they used them against Iran. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Tehran. According to Interior Minister Syed Mohammad Golubzoy, the previous regime in Afghanistan was supporting the very guerrillas it was supposed to be fighting. Golubzoy did not produce any evidence, but he said he had proof that recently assassinated President Hafizullah Amin was planning to form a new government with one of the rebel leaders as prime minister. The statement is the latest attempt to justify the Soviet invasion. It also reflects the Soviet approach of keeping a low profile here and using Afghanis politically and militarily whenever possible. The Afghan Air Force, using vintage MiG-15s and 17s, still patrols against rebel forces. But pilots are often accompanied by Soviet pilots, flying the larger and faster MiG-21s and 23s. It is believed the Soviets have 6 squadrons in Afghanistan, and they are being used largely to supervise the Afghan maneuvers. Shifting men and weapons around Kabul, they have effectively cordoned off the capital. They're content to act as a containment force, calling on the Afghan army to maintain order within the perimeter. It's in the rugged mountainside where the Soviets themselves have had to fight off attacks by tribesmen. In a recent incident, a Soviet convoy was ambushed near the town of Sharikar, 40 miles north of Kabul. One Western correspondent who witnessed the fighting said 5 Soviets were killed, and that there was no evidence of any guerrilla casualties. The clashes are still more of a nuisance than a threat to the Soviets, but they are occurring progressively closer to the capital, close enough to continue keeping Soviet forces occupied here. John McKenzie, CTV News, Kabul, Afghanistan. The much talked about Soviets in Afghanistan, but there are others, thousands of civilians who have been here much longer. They're called advisors, and over the past couple of years, their number and influence have increased noticeably. Most can be found living inside the Soviet embassy compound, or alongside Afghan families in a Russian-built apartment complex. Though there are not enough of these apartments to meet the rapidly growing demand. More are being built to accommodate the newly arrived Russian administrators and their families. The influx of Soviets has also created a shortage of certain staples like wheat and more recently meat. The Soviets spend a good deal of their free time shopping for food and clothes here in the markets of Kabul. This is also where they appear most out of place. They are better dressed and better fed than the Afghans, and what money they have, they spend. Well, that usually entails some haggling over price. These changes occur with any foreigner in the market. Afghans are resentful of Soviets, not personal reasons, but because Soviets are here, in a country that isn't theirs. The regime here has promised that Soviet troops will soon be out of Afghanistan. If that actually happens, there will still be several thousand Soviet bureaucrats left in the country, a presence which to many Afghans is just as unwelcome. McKenzie, CTV News, in Kabul, Afghanistan.
Turbulent celebration in Tehran. 3 people were run over by an army tank. Scores more were seriously injured by frenzied crowds. CTV's John McKenzie reports from Tehran.
This attempt at staging a parade is the most recent and vivid example of the lack of order in Iran. It was supposed to be a military parade, part of the festivities marking the first anniversary of the Islamic Revolution here. Just about everything was in place. All that was needed was room to advance. The crowds of spectators had blocked the street, and it was up to the authorities to clear it. For several hours they tried, all of them. Soldiers, police, Revolutionary Guards, committee members, all issuing orders, and often loud and conflicting orders. It soon erupted into a chaotic scene, pushing and shoving. Those who collapsed under the strain were able to leave only by being passed above the crowd. Just when it appeared that calm might be restored, President Hassan Bani Saad arrived, and the crowd surged forward once again. With him was PLO leader Yasser Arafat. Arafat was the first official guest to Iran after the revolution last year, and was invited back this week to take part in the anniversary celebrations. The only person missing was Iran's supreme ruler, Ayatollah Khomeini, who is still seriously ill in hospital. Eventually, a few dozen troops did manage to squeeze by the reviewing stand. The military that for so long fought to stop the revolution, but gave up against overwhelming crowds like this.
The future of the revolution in Iran will depend largely on whether the new regime here can restore some degree of order, whether it can exert control over the hundreds of thousands in a parade, or the 200 inside the U.S. Embassy.
The students occupying the embassy have openly defied President Bani Saad and the Revolutionary Council. They say they take orders only from Khomeini, and lately Khomeini has been too ill to do much of anything. This was the 100th day of the occupation, a fact that was either forgotten or ignored here by everyone. Everyone perhaps, but the 50 hostages still waiting inside. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Tehran.
The Canadian coat of arms has been taken down. The signs have been changed. It is now called the Danish Embassy Canadian Intersection. With Denmark's help, the embassy's local staff has resumed work on the hundreds of visa applications to Canada. But that's about the extent of activity here. Foreign Minister Sadak Gopsada is still angry about the way the embassy helped smuggle 6 U.S. diplomats out of the country. He maintains it was a political stunt orchestrated by Joe Clark. In fact, Pierre Trudeau and the Liberals won the election, he says, should lead to better relations now between Canada and Iran.
With the present government that I've seen before, they have some independence of their own. They have their own foreign policy. Obviously, they're allied with the United States. They work hands in hands. But at least they have some independence, and you can say, well, I'm talking to a Canadian, and tomorrow I'm talking to an American. So, in this respect, the situation has changed.
Has it changed enough, do you think, for Canada to reopen the embassy here?
Well, I think till the end of the crisis, probably it's not wise of the public reaction. But after the crisis, why not?
Canada said the work of the International Commission, which is now expected in Iran this weekend, is an important first step in solving the hostage crisis. But he repeated it is not enough in itself. Other points he made during the interview, there has been no agreement to release the hostages. Release is even possible before the Commission has finished its work. That he expects will take 2 weeks. 1 year, the Commission will have total freedom. Gupta says the hostages should testify before the inquiry, but that he will not force a showdown with the students. The students who hold the hostages inside the embassy compound have downplayed the importance of the Commission. They say the hostages will not testify, but partly they say they will provide it with embassy files they have confiscated. Today, more than 1,000 people gathered in front of the embassy to demonstrate their support. A rare sight nowadays as Iranian authorities try to defuse the crisis and isolate the students, at least for the time being. In the long run, though, Gopsadeh says the students will be consulted on any solution. Only with their cooperation can the crisis end peacefully. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Tehran. It's 5:40 p.m. The sunlight is fading quickly, and the commissioners leave their hotel for a tour of the National Cemetery, where Iran's revolutionary martyrs are buried. This wasn't scheduled. Commissioners had said earlier they had no time for such visits. We have work to do, they said. But a call from the Foreign Ministry after an unusually long meeting there earlier in the day changed all that. Within minutes, the commissioners were speeding through Tehran streets in a police convoy. 3/4 of an hour later, they reached the cemetery outside of Tehran. It was dusk. There were a few dozen Iranians to greet them and cameras to record their visit. The lawyers appeared grim and angry. They marched past rows of tombstones, stopping only briefly to stand together for photographers. All told, the group spent exactly 9 minutes at the cemetery before heading back to their hotel. But then heading back, the commissioners unknowingly were taken on a detour through the slums of South Tehran. Predictably, scores of screaming men and boys blocked their path, shouting the familiar anti-American slogans. The lawyers could only smile politely, staying inside or at least very close to their limousines and security guards. It was an embarrassing and somewhat frightening 10-minute wait. The question, though, is why? Why did they agree suddenly to a tour of the cemetery? And why they unwittingly found themselves here? Privately, they've said they don't want their investigation turned into a circus. They don't want to be used by Iranians. But some people believe they have had to make these concessions in order to at least see the hostages. The commissioners were being kept away from the embassy. Several thousand Iranian workers marched there. A spokesman for the militant students inside addressed the crowd and illustrated a fundamental problem the UN group is having. The spokesman asked, why does the commission want to meet the hostages? It won't be for evidence against the Shah or the United States. We don't want them to see the hostages, he said. If the mission is to fulfill its mandate, it will have to make progress on the hostage crisis. But at the moment, it's having trouble just getting inside these gates. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Tehran.
McKenzie is in Tehran.
The UN mission had gone through this exercise before of packing up and checking out of the hotel, but this time it was for real. 5 lawyers and their support staff were leaving Iran, having given up hope of seeing the hostages. Foreign Minister Sadak Gopsadeh met with them for 3 hours after midnight, trying to convince them to stay, and trying to get some agreement on what they should do next. Gopsadeh said that when the obstructions here are removed, the commission would be invited back to Iran. He said its departure today, though, was not a sign it had failed.
The mission has not failed. I wouldn't say it 100% succeeded, but I would say really 70% that succeeded already to do the work. And for the rest of 30%, I'm doing everything in my power to realize it. And with your help and the help of the others, we'll be able to do that.
The commissioners left saying they were not in a position to prepare their report. They still need to see all of the hostages to complete their work. They also said they would welcome more documents, but not, it appears, from the militant students. 2 students arrived at the hotel with files taken from the U.S. Embassy. They said they had 480 pages showing American interference in Iran's affairs, and had come to turn them over to the commission, just as Ayatollah Khomeini had ordered. The The commissioners, though, refused to accept them, saying the file should be passed through proper channels, through the Ministry of Justice. The argument continued at the airport. Gopsada had to intervene, and for several minutes he and the students were engaged in an animated debate. Commission co-chairman Mohammed Bejoui looking on, watching another domestic quarrel. It was domestic quarrels like this that prevented the commission from fulfilling its mandate and forced it to leave. With its departure was the faint hope of an early hostage release. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Tehran.
Some reaction to the Commission's departure, UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim pleaded for patience, saying the release of the hostages is only a matter of time. He said the Commission could return to Iran once the power struggle is resolved. President Carter was bitter. He said things are where they stood 4 months ago. 50 Americans captive, no sign of freedom.
Every summer for the past 86 years, the BBC or other symphony orchestras have put on a series of concerts. They are strictly classical, strictly that is until the final performance of the season. Then it becomes something of a carnival. It's the end of a term, and as good a reason as any to celebrate. The final night of the Promenade concerts features the music of British composers, played by British musicians, and all carried live on BBC radio and television. With millions at home sharing the excitement, the grand finale came together looking like this. The last night of the proms is simply an evening of fun, a time for unabashed chest thumping and flag waving, a good time to be British. John McKenzie, CTV News, in London. Steeped in 370 years of tradition, Charterhouse is one of Britain's original independent schools, one of the right schools. Students here are not only given an education, they are given a whole way of life, one the Labour Party would like to do away with.
What they do get is the old school tie network and lots of social advantages which will help them to get jobs, which in these days of difficulty, unemployment, that's very important to them. So they're buying advantages and buying privileges which we think should not be available.
Most independent schools offer the advantages of smaller classes and better teachers, and a more rigorous academic program than the state schools. Students are encouraged to go on to university, especially to Oxford or Cambridge, and a good many of them do. After all, these students are exceptional. They have been carefully selected to make sure they are smart enough and their parents are rich enough. The total cost of a high school education at Charterhouse is $55,000, a price families can afford.
Wherever you are in life, there are going to be injustices. I don't think you can abolish something which is good simply because everybody can't enjoy it. A target for people to work for. I said earlier, a lot of our parents are first-generation parents. They worked hard from quite humble beginnings in order that their sons can enjoy the kind of education they would like to have had.
For families, it is considered an investment. Put out in this kind of environment doesn't guarantee he'll be successful later in life, but it certainly helps. It's good most independent schools in Britain offer more than state schools. Those who come here to Charterhouse, for example, are considered privileged. What the Labour Party is asking is whether those people with money should have the right to buy that privilege. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Surrey, England.
Yes.
They arrived tired and visibly shaken, but all were lucky to be alive. Only 38 hours earlier, the petrochemical plant they were building in southern Iraq was attacked by 2 Iranian Phantom jets. There was little damage to the actual production area, but the workers' living quarters were bombed and strafed. In an hour, the survivors, these engineers and their families, began a large-scale evacuation, trying to safety in nearby Kuwait. On the first out are several Canadians who told CTV what they experienced.
Between 6:10 and 6:15, we heard the plane coming over our site, and then suddenly just bingo. All right, they let go a few bombs, and some of them just went past the administration building, with most of the people are working. As far as the financial group and administration group is concerned, and some of our engineers and subcontract people and construction director, manager, and all that type of people. And one of them fall quite close to it. The other one fall on the garage and the workshop, where we had quite a few people, local and expatriates, foreigners in there. After that, it went on. They went on with let you go on the camp where people live.
My office, which is about 300 feet from where the first bomb hit, and I heard the planes come over. And I saw the first one, and I saw him drop the 5 bombs, and the other one behind dropped another 5. And it hit, like I said, about 300 feet from me. And a couple of my good friends got killed there.
Killed?
Yes. So I saw them come down. There's nothing I could do. It's just everybody panicked and people ran around all over.
For the Loomis Company says 2 more evacuation flights are planned, and that if all goes according to schedule, all of the company's 600 employees in Iraq will be out of the country and back home by the end of the week. John McKenzie, CTV News in Amsterdam.
The leaders were arriving for their first session as word of the Soviet announcement began to spread through the summit site. The heads of government aboard motor launches, and in one rather ostentatious case, a U.S. Navy convoy, had heard nothing of the show. The one exception was French President Giscard d'Estaing. He received a personal message from Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev on Friday, but didn't tell any of his colleagues until this first meeting. Most of them were skeptical about Moscow's intentions. As the leaders met privately on St. Giorgio Island, there's word from the French delegation that they expected their message from Moscow to have an impact on the summit's declaration. But when Italian Premier Francesco Cossiga spoke on behalf of the 7 leaders, it was clear that, if anything, the Western line had been toughened.
We have to restate that the military occupation of Afghanistan is unacceptable now, because we are decided to not accept it in the future too. Afghanistan should be enabled to regain her sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and its traditional non-aligned character.
U.S. President Jimmy Carter thus got the support he'd been hoping for. At the Soviet statement, he was doubtful.
If these reports are confirmed, and these withdrawals are permanent, and if these withdrawals are just a first step in moving the Soviets toward a permanent and total withdrawal of their forces from Afghanistan, then of course this will be a significant thing.
External Affairs Minister Mark McGuigan said Canada had been a leading voice in pressing for a tough statement on Afghanistan. He suggested Moscow might be trying to undo the Olympic boycott.
Well, this is a Soviet taken in view of the Olympic Games to try to soften resistance to them, or whether it is the beginning of a real withdrawal from Afghanistan, we don't know, but we're highly suspicious that it is not the latter, not a real withdrawal. It's much less than that, and therefore it's put in that perspective by the summit partners.
Like 5 similar conferences before it, this gathering in Venice is supposed to be an economic summit. To an unprecedented degree, though, the problems of international politics have overshadowed the Western world's growing economic crisis. What the leaders have said so far on the economy has been neither surprising nor inspiring. The also covered broad economic topics, particularly oil prices and recession. Trudeau told the summit he considers unemployment a more serious problem than inflation. The first ministers went off to a state dinner with one of the final communiques well advanced. In addition to the Afghanistan declaration, the seven have pledged to help each other's diplomats in cases of hostage-taking. On the economy, though, only one thing is certain. There will be plans and promises, no solutions. Peter Lowe, CTV News, in Venice.
Tucked away in the lush countryside of eastern England is the town of Thetford. There's nothing here of any strategic importance. A few small factories, a few dozen shops lining the square. This is simply a peaceful, relaxing little town, and people here want to keep it that way. Though some are a little uneasy about what's happening just down the road. 9 miles from Thetford is the Lakenheath Armed Forces Base. For years, American pilots have been based here, along with a large stockpile of nuclear weapons for the planes they fly. Now, if the United States government gets its way, Lakenheath will house America's newest and most sophisticated nuclear weapon, the cruise missile. The weapon is still in the development stage. With a range of 2,000 miles, it flies just above the trees and well below most radar scans. As part of Britain's commitment to NATO, she has agreed to have 160 of these weapons stationed in the country within the next 3 years. The government hasn't said where, but Washington wants them added to the arsenal at Lakenheath. Many people living in the area, though, are against the idea, and they forced a referendum on the issue. The question? Would you be in favor of a government proposal to site nuclear cruise missiles at bases near to Thetford? The campaign was a coalition of groups led by the town's mayor.
Not just against cruise missiles, but against all nuclear weapons and all forms of nuclear energy. That's true, but that's just my personal point of view. And one of the strengths of the nuclear movement is that it does take in people with views ranging from people like myself to those who merely wish not to have cruise missiles deployed.
By the time voting day rolled around, just about every possible argument for and against had been heard. Nobody wants nuclear missiles, but for some they're a kind of necessary evil, even in Thetford.
I'm not worried. I think it's the best thing because then one would go so very quickly.
Polls were only open for a few hours, but that's all that was needed to record the vote. 603 people in favor of the missiles, 577 opposed. But the count has already been ordered. The outcome of the referendum is not binding on anyone. It is simply an expression of public opinion. But before the ballots were even counted, those who had called for the referendum were claiming a victory. They said they did everything they said to do. Able to get more people at least thinking about the nuclear issue. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Thetford, England. Yes, high society in Britain is alive and doing very well, and likely continue that way as long as there's Henley. This is one of the highlights of the British social calendar. Of course, Ascot and Wimbledon and the Derby. None with a setting as fair as this. Perched on the banks of the River Thames, Britain's elite can sip champagne while watching the racing fleet skim by. It is, after all, a sporting event with some of the world's best oarsmen. But for the socialites who make the annual pilgrimage to Henley, this event has become much more.
I think it's a very upper class, if you like, sport and a meeting, and I think obviously people are going to emulate that, and so everybody will try and get in.
No day here would be complete without the traditional strawberries and cream, and at least a few hours around the reviewing stand. Henley, this is the place to be, where the music is so delightful. A fashion sublime. Sporting jackets and ties from all the right schools. People know who they are and what they're doing. At least they think they do. The Henley is a classic British event, a peculiar mixture of sport and high society. Those who come to row and those who come to be rowed. John McKenzie, CTV News, on the Thames. marquee is bare and doors are locked. There are 5 theaters in London's West End that have closed down, and producers are worried there could soon be many more. A recent survey showed only 66% of theater tickets are actually being sold. In a good theaters, that rate is much lower. The problem, London theatre, like most everything else here, has priced itself out of the tourist market. Inflation, a strong pound, and crippling taxes have pushed ticket prices as high as $23 for some musicals. Theaters are going through the same kind of slump Broadway experienced 5 years ago. In New York, it took new marketing techniques and aggressive theater management to turn things around. But it's a formula that might prove hard to copy here in London. The musical Chicago. Despite rave reviews, the theater remained half empty. It was scheduled to close on Saturday night until the cast agreed to take a pay cut to keep production going. The union, though, did not agree. The director called an impromptu meeting on the theater steps, forbidding actors to work for less money.
Once a show starts, you don't cut salaries. You take it off if you can't afford to pay them, and you make way for someone who's prepared to pay the right salaries for the people concerned.
But what's going to happen if we all decide we want to do a show?
We're going to do the show on Wednesday, so what then?
Get more money.
You will oblige me to issue you with an instruction not to...
What right have you got? You haven't got anything to do that. You have got no right if we have new contracts. You have no right at all.
If you tried to do this with any other show, most of the people would be gone. But under the present economic circumstances, fine, there is no other work, so we're still here, so we want to do it.
If London theatre is to change, it will need cooperation from the unions. This dispute was resolved with the Actors Union digging into its emergency trust fund to keep the play going. No one had to take a pay cut, and more important, 107 jobs were saved.
We want to work. All we want to do is basically work.
I want work for us to go on stage, please.
McKenzie, CTV News in London.
Trudeau came to London seeking British support for early patriation of the Constitution. British Parliament still legally controls Canada's founding act. Both, though, have for years wanted to remove that last vestige of colonialism. The Prime Minister started with an amusing dispute over where young Justin Trudeau should pose for photographers.
His father says no.
He doesn't have to be elected, I do.
The 10 Downing Street lasted about 3 hours. Afterwards, Trudeau said he explained to Mrs. Thatcher the urgency he attaches to renewed federalism.
For that reason, it was likely that we would be coming to Britain sometime in the future to have amendments to the British North America Act.
The future, he says, means this fall or certainly within 12 months. Trudeau, while getting an offer of support and assistance from the British Prime Minister, did not discuss how Westminster would react to patriation if attempted it over the objection of some provinces. Trudeau says he's hopeful of a consensus by September.
I'm optimistic about that, and I didn't ask her to speculate on any other hypotheses.
Trudeau hedged when asked if the British Prime Minister would support patriation under any circumstances, for instance, Ottawa acting alone.
She didn't say that, and I didn't ask her to say that. When you say any circumstances, I told her I was a liberal, and therefore I was an optimist, and therefore I thought that everything would come up roses in September.
The Queen drove into Buckingham Palace just a few minutes before Trudeau arrived. The Prime Minister again wanted to discuss the constitutional situation, this time in the secrecy of a meeting between a monarch and a First Minister. It's true that the British would like to rid themselves of the British North America Act just as soon as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a major constitutional squabble in Canada would have no impact here. It's entirely possible that some British MPs would object to Ottawa acting against provincial wishes. The concern in the Trudeau camp is that such objections could cause an embarrassing delay in any future patriation debate at Westminster. Peter Lloyd, CTV News, in London.
Scotland Yard is keeping a close watch on the Libyan embassy. There are at least 5 people working out of here who do not have diplomatic status. So far, the Foreign Office has not been able to establish just what they're doing here, but Scotland Yard suspects they are part of a Libyan assassination squad. Last month, a Libyan journalist was gunned down outside London's largest mosque. 2 weeks later, another was killed in a quiet side street. Police believe the weapons used in the murders were smuggled into Britain in 9 diplomatic pouches, and that the gunmen were sent here by Colonel Gaddafi, with orders to kill his Libyan opponents who refused to return home. There are reports the police have discovered a list of assassination targets. This news has shaken London's Arab community. Newspapers published here, like Al Arab, have been openly critical of the leaders back home. Some staff now fear for their lives. Some have gone in hiding, and others have asked Scotland Yard for protection, or at least more information.
What we need is basically all the facts published. And if there are any person who is in immediate danger, this person should be notified.
Members of Parliament think that's not enough. They want the government to start pressuring Libyan authorities.
The head of the Libyan state has announced that he's going to carry out terrorist activities in Britain. So we can pick on him straight away because he's announced that he's going to do it. And clearly we can't expect the Metropolitan Police to go around picking up every Arab-looking person in London. That's quite unreasonable. So I think the government have got to take some action.
Colonel Gaddafi's open threats of murder are seen here as a challenge to British authority. Minister Thatcher has sent Gaddafi a personal note warning that political killings would not be tolerated here. The next step the government could take would be to expel members of the Libyan mission. That would likely be a long and drawn-out procedure, and one Britain is trying hard to avoid. John McKenzie, CTV News, in London. If you want to change Canada's constitution, if you want to see it, you first have to come to London. Here in Westminster, stacked alongside nearly 100,000 other bills, is the British North America Act. The British Act which gave Canada its independence. It is no special bill. It has a special place, tucked inside a red cardboard box in the government archives. Canadians have long wanted to get control of their constitution, but never been able to agree on how to do it, or how to go about changing the Act once they've got it. British members of Parliament want to see that debate resolved in Canada, and until it is, at least 20 MPs here warn they could disrupt attempts to repatriate the Constitution.
Answering any threats, all to say is that it could be profoundly embarrassing, and that is why I very much hope, as a result of the consultations between Minister Trudeau and the minorities in Canada, that everyone will be happy with the arrangements.
I would find it a little difficult to accept that the bill would come to the House at all if there were a substantial body of opinion which were not in favour of it in Canada.
During Prime Minister Trudeau's visit here last month, government and opposition leaders told him that the British Parliament could hand over control of the Constitution quickly, but only if there is no opposition. Some MPs here say they'll want to make sure Canadian Indians are not disadvantaged by a new agreement. Other MPs could be approached by Canadian provinces to take up their case inside Westminster. The backbenchers could drag out the debate by several weeks, but that is not considered the real worry.
It is fact that there might be the possibilities of major groupings, even a political party, possibly constitutional devices that could be played in aid. All this presents a rather frightening picture, and I'm sure the British government would want to be doubly reassured before it went on this journey. Imagine the position if Mrs. Thatcher had to get up and defend a position when, say, certain provinces were visibly opposing it, and were not merely opposing it in Canada, but were deploying forces in England to oppose it as well.
The British have a strong sense of wanting to do well by Canada, of wanting to give Canadians what they ask for. But they say problems begin when Canadians can't agree. The thing Britain does not want is to have the constitutional debate transferred here to Westminster. John McKenzie, CTV News, in London. They came to the Canadian embassy not really knowing what to expect. but they knew what they wanted, Canadian visas they've been seeking for the past several months. Most students who had been scheduled to receive the necessary papers this week. It is not known how many Iranians such as these are directly affected by the closure of the Canadian embassy, but it is generally estimated here at more than 200. People who have paid their tuition and airfare, passed interviews and medical exams. Al Vanessy, the 20-year-old son of a welder, figures he spent $6,000 so far trying to get into Canada and the Hansa Language Center in Toronto.
Very difficult. I'm just a student and I want to study in Canada. Nothing else. I paid very much, and the day I should get the visa, the embassy is closed. What should I say?
What are you going to do now?
I don't know.
Up until this weekend, the only thing these Iranians received was a notice taped by the embassy door telling them to watch for further instructions. At mid-morning, a telex from the Department of External Affairs was posted, advising them to contact Canadian embassies in other countries. The instructions only created more confusion. Some have their passports and documents locked inside the embassy here. Others face the prospect of being drafted into the Iranian army if they don't leave the country within the next month. Most of the students are disgruntled and disorganized. They've read the various notices posted to the embassy wall, but without someone here to direct them, they appear lost. John McKenzie, CTV News in Tehran. The Commission did not receive any new documents or testimony. It did not embark on any more fact-finding missions. The only time the commissioners left their hotel was to go shopping at the bazaar. There was really not much for the 5 lawyers to do here now, but wait to see the hostages. Commission members say as soon as they do that, they'll be able to leave Tehran and write their report quickly.
Well, I suppose this is about the end of our mission. And as soon as the visit to the hostages takes place, we will be able to start writing our report, which will be submitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and we will finish it either in Geneva or in New York, and this will not take long.
The Commission has yet to get the approval from the students who control the embassy compound. It appears there is still some disagreement over what the Commission can do once inside, whether it can simply meet the hostages or whether it must interrogate them, and how many hostages can it see? It's estimated there are 50, but up until now, no visitor to the compound has been able to meet more than 43 of the captives. While the students bar the Commission from the embassy, they continue to invite journalists inside, here to expose more documents about a Turkish counterfeit ring operating in Iran. They say that U.S. embassy personnel are guilty because they knew about the operation but did nothing to stop it. The student released one document signed by the embassy's chargé d'affaires Bruce Langan, which states, "Coordination with Iranian National Police is not an option available to us, since they do not represent a viable authority." That conclusion was supported 2 weeks later by occupation of the embassy by militant students. The person who has authority over the students is Ayatollah Khomeini. The 79-year-old ruler made an unusual appearance from his hospital, where he spent more than a month recovering from a heart attack. Speaking briefly to a group of 100 gathered below his balcony, he urged that Iranians take part in the upcoming parliamentary elections, that they elect those who are neither Eastern nor Western, but good Muslims, people who know their religion. Unless he says otherwise, it will be up to that parliament to decide when and how the hostages will be released. Tonight, Khomeini was greeted by a mob scene as he was moved out of the hospital into a small apartment that has been prepared for him in Tehran. Khomeini is still the authority in the country, but even he cannot always ensure there is order. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Tehran.
There are no more than 200 men in all. They don't have much in the way of weapons or training, yet these are the people who control one of the main roads 50 miles north of Kabul. They are rebels fighting Afghan and Soviet soldiers, or more specifically, resisting communism, resisting its land reform programs and literacy campaigns that violate Islamic teachings. Aware how insecure their position is here, the rebels patrol the area in bands of 10 or 20, most armed with handguns or rifles, many from the Second World War. They also set up observation posts up the hillside and points on the road itself. It is questionable whether they will be able to remain here much longer. Most parts of the countryside held by the rebels are of little military or strategic value to the regime. That is not the case here, on the main roads through central Afghanistan. Up till now, there have been heavy snowfalls in the area, and Soviet troops have not taken much initiative. And when they do, these rebels would appear to have little chance of stopping them. In cities like Kabul, the odds are even worse, yet resistance is evident. Today, several shots rang out from a residential area in the city's north end. Eyewitnesses said at least one Soviet soldier was hit while sitting in a jeep. In minutes of the incident, dozens of Soviet troops appeared and began a house-to-house search. It's not known whether anyone was arrested. It's been almost a month now since Soviet troops invaded the Afghan cities and countryside, and their continued presence here has intensified the Afghan fight against communism, both foreign and domestic. John McKenzie, CTV News, in Kabul, Afghanistan.